Welcome to Chapter 1 of the Baylis textbook. At the beginning of many of the chapters, I'll post an Instagram picture like this one and encourage you to pause and read through it. Instagram has amazing photography with the National Geographic account, and so it's a really cool way to look about different places in the world. A couple of reminders with the textbook. It is really important that you purchase and use the assigned edition. There are multiple editions of this book, but you need to have the most recent one. And it doesn't matter if it's print or online, either one is fine. Read the chapters for each week. There will be weeks where there are multiple chapters assigned, and so make sure that you are taking a careful look at the chapters that you need to watch. And it's not always in sequential order, and so the numbers and titles are really important. Test yourself often. This can be flashcards, you can do online quizzes that are available through the textbook, whatever your style is, but it's really important that you don't just read the chapter. That's a great place to start, but you're going to want to do more in order to help remember the information. And then in the syllabus, you'll see information on how to make a concept map. You can use these on the exams that we will have, and there are a couple of different sites that can do those. Both CMAP and Miro are the best ones that I've found with the previous classes, and you can use those on the exam and also upload those for extra credit. And then ask questions. We'll have engagement moments with Play Pause It with these lectures, but you can always email, and I'm happy to help clarify the content. Here's Chapter 1. So the first question is to take a moment and think about, how do you define globalization? Now we'll look at how the book defines globalization. The book breaks it down by several different schools or theories. So for liberals, globalization is going to be the end product of a progressive change to global politics. Okay, so it's the goal. For realists, they're going to see globalization as more of a connected kind of thing. And so the states are still sovereign, but they're struggling for power. And so it's a much more hostile, contentious kind of environment. If you're a constructivist theory, then you're going to look at globalization as a force that is acting on the states, right? And so we can construct the rights, we can build social movements, but it is something that we do, right? If you're a Marxist, globalization is a total sham. And it's really just another stage in capitalism, and it's a theory led by the Western society. If you're a post-structuralist, then you really don't believe globalization exists. You just feel it's a discourse, or it is a way of talking. For the post-colonial school of thought, it is a way for colonial powers to persist. Right? It's just another way to maintain that power imbalance. And then lastly, if you're looking at the feminist theory, it is a gendered form of power. And so I encourage you thinking about a movement, or a situation, whether it be COVID or perhaps some of the social movements that have happened globally, and think of how each of these theories might address that. So when we're looking at globalization, the first thing to think about is, what is the evidence? And when we look at economic policy and transnational companies, you'll hear these referred to as TNCs. So examples would be Coca-Cola, Apple. These TNCs can be really important drivers of economic change. There's also the aspect of mobilizing people. We see this taking place through social movements or campaigns such as Amnesty International's Human Rights Campaign. We might also see evidence in communications. It is now possible to follow the events anywhere. If you think about a number of years ago when we had the Ferguson protests in the US, protesters in Ferguson, Missouri were getting advice from protesters in Gaza, because they were able to see what was happening globally and giving advice on not pouring water on tear gas, what to do if you're tear gassed. The way we communicate is global. You can learn about what's going on in the Ukraine. You can learn about what's going on in the Congo. With the recent US elections, this was being followed all over the world. And another area of evidence are transnational problems. We know climate change is a big challenge. Everyone is affected by this. The COVID-19 pandemic affected every country in the world. We also can see problems with pollution. And so the idea with each of these areas is that the problems don't just stay within a certain country or state. They affect the global. And so globalization really is more of an interdependence. And you'll hear the word state used often. That doesn't mean like the state of Wisconsin. It's going to be like the state of the United States or of Germany. Okay, state is the international language for country. Nation states are a little bit different. Nation tends to relate to sort of ethnicity or some sort of commonality that may be separate from the government. The idea is that all of these are connected through globalization through this community. And so here's a basic definition for you. The shift in the scale of human social organization that links distant communities and expands the reach of power relations across regions and continents. And so to give you one example that is being discussed quite recently since the election in the United States are challenges with migration. This is a map from 2015. And the reason it is included, I understand it's now a few years old, but it's a really important visual representation of what migration looked like at the time, and you can think about sort of similarities to today. So the first section, where people are fleeing from. See, at the time, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, and Eritrea. This has actually stayed very similar, a little bit less so with Eritrea now, but Afghanistan and Syria have been quite challenging for quite some time. Where are these migrants going? Where are people fleeing to? They're going at the time, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Libya, and Hungary. And it's important that, with refugees, we'll talk about this later in the course, there are certain criteria that you have to meet to be considered a refugee, one of which is fleeing to a different country and fleeing for specific reasons. Okay? And so where are these refugees trying to go? At the time, because of the conflict, you can see on the map, they're trying to go across the sea largely to Europe. Germany was one of the most welcoming at the time, but the United Kingdom also accepted a tremendous number of refugees as well. Italy and Greece were sort of landing points, and so a lot of the boats that were coming in from Libya particularly were landing in these countries. And so in more recent years, the United States has taken in a number of Afghan refugees. And I'll talk a little bit more throughout the course about an organization that I worked with called World Relief. They're all over the country, but they are a refugee resettlement agency. And the office that I worked with was in Appleton. And so I actually had Afghan clients who had fled the Taliban when the Taliban took over after the U.S. withdrawal. And so I'll give multiple examples from my experiences throughout our course. This is a bit more recent to show you where some of the positive migration is. This is areas people are going to. And then you can see in the reds and pinks where people are fleeing from. And people are fleeing for all sorts of different reasons. It really often is conflict driven, but in some cases could also be resource driven, as water shortages or food insecurity can just make it really difficult to survive, or gang violence, that sort of thing. And so thinking about the most dangerous migration routes. This is a few years old, very, very similar to today. You can see the U.S.-Mexico border crossing. As they happen, there have been quite a few updates recently, and we'll expect more with the change in U.S. administration. President Trump has a very different border policy than his predecessor, and so we'll highlight those differences as they get announced. Additional areas, the Mediterranean really is one of the most dangerous right after the United States. Waters are very choppy, and the volume of people trying to cross can be challenging. And so for this content check-in, these will appear periodically throughout the lectures. Take a moment and think about, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges facing migrants as they flee their home country in search of safety? There are four main concepts of globalization that we'll look at. The first is that we're expanding social, political, and economic activities across borders. The second, there's a growing magnitude of connection and also associated harms. I think we saw this very profoundly with the recent pandemic. There's also a faster pace of transportation and communication. And so this means a faster movement of ideas, news, or goods in the world. It is simply easier to get things from one place to another in lots of different ways and at a much different speed. And then there's a growing intensity of local and global interactions, that we are more aware of what is happening in the world. And as I mentioned with the US election, everyone is watching the US election because you had two very different candidates with very different visions for the world. And that will have implications on all of the other countries. There's a few different patterns of globalization to highlight today. The first is economic. I mentioned the TNCs earlier in the lecture. Those are one example of how economic factors are global, but there are also regional organizations like the European Union, which is both political and an economic union of the countries that are part of it. For military, this can be examples such as the global arms trade, but it could also be issues of terrorism. We looked at the recent conflict in the Middle East. A lot of the weapons that were being used by the Israeli military in Gaza were supplied by the United States. That is a globalization of military supplies that were in furtherance of a conflict. And we can see impacts of military engagement with Russia and the Ukraine had huge consequences on global grain supply and also what it means for Russian control in Eastern Europe. There are legal patterns. International law will be a chapter that is covered in this course, and every country has agreed to follow and abide by a number of different international laws and treaties. We'll highlight those as we go through the different chapters, but it's one way where there are norms. For example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We've all agreed to those. We have globalized our value of human rights. There are ecological patterns of globalization. This is my main area of expertise, teaching environmental policy, and we can look at this in a lot of different ways. I think climate change is probably the most obvious, that this is affecting everybody. Even if your country is not polluting, you're a very small island developing state, you're still experiencing the harms of bigger countries like the United States and China, who are emitting tremendous amounts of greenhouse gases and fossil fuel usage. And so our effects and our use patterns and decisions are going to affect the entire world. There are cultural patterns of globalization, and this could be positive, this could be more negative. You think about different music artists that you might listen to, different apps, millions and millions of people using TikTok as one example. We can communicate our culture all around the world without ever having to go to some places, but also to learn more about different cultures in a positive way too. And then social. A lot of different aspects of this one. I think the migration that we saw with those charts is a good example where you can see how we are moving, we are engaging with people in different ways through globalization. An important concept that we'll return to often in the course is sovereignty. And this goes back to the Peace of Westphalia, really, really old treaty. And sovereignty means the right to legal and political authority within a defined territory. This is going to be enshrined in Article 2.1 of the United Nations Charter. And so it is really the core of all of our international laws. This idea that you as a country, you as Peru, are sovereign for Peru. No one can tell you what to do. No one can make you do something. You are choosing to govern your people the way you choose. And this can be, I think, frustrating in some cases if someone disagrees with what a country is doing, but particularly when we get to environmental issues, it's really difficult because you might be choosing to pollute a lot, but someone else will be having to deal with the harms of that. So this is always going to be in tension with a lot of areas that we'll discuss this semester. A few different basic aspects with this particular Peace of Westphalia to discuss. It will establish the basis of modern statehood. So this idea that you can have a defined era, you can have a defined Germany, you can have a defined France, okay, that France is a state. Its purpose at the time was to get leaders in Europe to recognize each other's rights, to decide for their own country. Because the past had been sort of this warring philosophy of taking over, that you can decide what another country should do or what another area should do. So by establishing the statehood, you then establish the right to make decisions within your own borders. So the three main concepts with this will be territoriality, sovereignty and autonomy. So the territory is that defined space. Sovereignty is the exclusive jurisdiction in that space. And then autonomy is going to be the power to govern and conduct diplomacy. So you get your space, you have your rules, and then you can do things to govern and actually run it. And I'll post the link to the video so you can enjoy this. Just kind of a lighthearted, fun one. So when we're looking at global politics, global policy networks will be something that we return to often. This is a way to collaborate globally. We can share research, we can do advocacy. One really good example is the Global Policy Forum. This is an independent watchdog that monitors the UN and engages in global policy making. They tend to focus on peace and security, social justice, and international law. We can also consider different types of global governance, all sorts of different forms that exist out there, sort of how you organize your government. For transnational civil society, this is going to be a global advocacy group, and that doesn't always mean it's pro-rights, human rights. It could easily be authoritarian. And so we'll talk about different types of civil society actors. And then looking at changes to globalization post-Westphalia, we have seen the growth of international institutions and a whole host of agreements. And as we go through the chapters, we'll talk about quite a few of those different agreements. And we've also started to see, just with globalization, the exchange of new ideas and cultures. You can learn about places that you've never been to. You can learn about new ideas in a lot of different ways, and that's really exciting. And so I mentioned the territoriality has also been a change. The sovereignty continues to grow. In some areas it is recognized, other areas it is not. Palestine is a really interesting example in this respect, where it has observer status at the United Nations, but is not recognized by some countries and is recognized by others. And then that autonomy, that Westphalia defined these borders and set up that sovereignty, but post-Westphalia, we really have seen states become autonomous and govern themselves. And so for the last content check-in, give one example of globalization that we discussed in class through this lecture today.